Chapter 11. When he leapt over the threshold of the portal door, George found he was floating. Not going up, not going down, just drifting in this huge great darkness of outer space. He looked back towards the doorway, but the hole in space where it should have been had closed over as though it had never been. There was no way back now, and the giant rock was getting closer all the time. "Hold my hand!" Annie shouted to George. As he gripped her in his space glove even harder, he started to feel as if they were falling down towards the comet, moving faster and faster, as if they were on a giant helter-skelter. George and Annie spiralled towards the huge rock, getting closer and closer all the time. Beneath them, they could see that one side of the comet, the bit facing the sun, was brightly lit. But the other side, which the sun's rays didn't reach, was in darkness. Eventually, they landed in a heap on a thick layer of icy dust-covered rubble. Luckily, they'd come down on the bright side of the comet so they could see what lay around them. Ha 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 ha! Annie was laughing as she picked herself up. She hauled George to his feet and brushed bits of dirty ice and crumbly rock off him. "So," she said, "do you believe me now?" "Where are we?" said George, who was so surprised he quite forgot to be so scared. George felt extremely light. He looked around and saw rock, ice, snow, and darkness. It was like standing on a giant dirty snowball someone had thrown into outer space. Stars blazed everywhere, their fiery glow quite different from the twinkling lights he saw from the Earth. "We're having an adventure," replied Annie. "On a comet, and it's real. It isn't a made-up story, is it?" "No, it isn't," admitted George. He patted her spacesuit awkwardly. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you, Annie." "That's all right," said Annie generously. "No one ever does. That's why I had to show you. Look, George!" She waved her arm around. "You're going to see the planets in the solar system." She started to pull a length of rope out of a pocket in her spacesuit. On the other end of the rope was a spike, like a tent peg. Using her space boot, she jammed the spike into the ice on the comet's surface. Watching her, George gave a tiny little jump for joy. Even though he was wearing the spacesuit that seemed quite heavy on Earth, he couldn't believe how light he felt. So light that he thought he could leap as high as he wanted. He did another little jump across a little crack on the comet's surface. This time, he went up and forward and he didn't come down again. He seemed to be taking a giant leap, maybe hundreds of meters long. He'd never be able to find Annie again. "Help! Help!" George called through the helmet as his jump carried him further and further away, as his arms whirling in the surrounding emptiness, as he tried to make himself fall down onto the comet. But it was no good. Annie was far away in the distance now. He could only just see her when he looked back. The comet's surface was passing quickly below him. He could see holes and little hills everywhere, but nothing that he could grab onto. But at last, he seemed to fall. The ground was getting closer now, and he landed and slid onto the ice near the threshold between the bright and dark side of the comet. In the distance, he saw Annie carefully running towards him. "If you can hear me, don't jump again," she was saying in a very urgent voice. "If you can hear me, don't jump again. If you can..." "I won't," he called back as she reached him. "Don't do that, George," said Annie. "You could have just landed on the dark side of the comet. I might have never found you. Now stand up. The boots have small spikes on their soles." She sounded very grown up and not at all like the impish little girl he had met at Eric's house. "A comet is different from Earth. We weigh much less here than we do there, so when we jump, it can take us a long, long way. This is a different world." "Oh, look," she added, changing the subject. "We're just in time." "For what?" asked George. "For that." Annie pointed to the other side of the comet. Behind the comet was a trail of ice and dust, which was getting steadily longer. As it grew, it caught the light from the faraway sun and glistened in the wake of the comet, making it look as though thousands of diamonds were shining in outer space. "That's beautiful," whispered George. For a minute, he and Annie just stood there in silence. As George watched the trail grow, he realised it was made up of bits of the bright side of the comet. "The rock's melting!" said George in a panic, clutching Annie's arm. "What will happen when there's nothing left?" "Don't worry," Annie shook her head. "We're just getting closer to the sun. The sun slowly warms up the bright side of the comet and the ice turns into gas. But it's okay because there's enough ice here for us to pass the sun loads of times. Anyway, the rock under the ice won't melt, so we won't start falling through space, if that's what you're scared of." "I'm not scared," protested George, letting go of her arm very suddenly. "I was just asking." "Then ask more interesting questions," said Annie. "Like what?" asked George. "Like, what would happen if some of the rocks from the comet's tail fell on the Earth?" George kicked some of the dust around, then said reluctantly, "Right. What would happen?" "Now that is a good question," said Annie, sounding pleased. "The rocks catch fire when they enter the Earth's atmosphere, and from the ground, when we look up, they become what we call shooting stars or meteors. They stood and gazed until the comet's tail got so long that they couldn't see the end of it. But as they were watching it, the comet seemed to start changing direction. All the stars in the background were moving." "What's happening?" asked George. "Quick," Annie replied. "We've only got a few seconds. Sit down, George." She cleared 2 little spaces on the ice, speedily brushing the powder aside with her glove. Reaching into another pocket of her suit, she produced what looked like climbing hooks. "Sit down," she ordered again. She screwed on the hooks into the ground and then fastened them onto a longish piece of cord hanging from a buckle on George's suit. "Just in case something hits you," she added. "Like what?" asked George. "Well, I don't know. My dad normally does this bit," she replied. Next, she sat down beside George and did the same to herself. "Do you like roller coasters?" she asked him. "I don't know," said George, who'd never been on one. "Well, you're about to find out," said Annie, laughing. The comet was definitely falling, or at least changing direction towards what seemed to be down. From the way the stars were moving all around him, George understood that the comet was falling very fast, but he couldn't feel anything. He didn't have butterflies in his stomach, and there was no rush of air blowing past him. It wasn't at all how he had expected a ride on a roller coaster to feel. But he was starting to realise that things feel very different in outer space from the way they do on Earth. George closed his eyes for a moment, just to see if he could feel anything at all. But no, nothing. Suddenly, with his eyes closed, he realised that something in space must be pulling them, and the comet towards it for the comet to change direction like that. George instinctively knew that this something was probably much, much bigger than the comet on which he and Annie were surfing through outer space in.